Hey, U.S. History students, this is part two of our first unit on exploration from 1491 to 1607. And just to reiterate a few things, we left off last time talking about how upon Europe or before European arrival, we had a very complex and diverse system of societies amongst the different Native American groups and things. And what we also focused our attention on was the arrival of the Europeans and what drove them, the idea of economic things, wealth, of course, spreading religion, and other factors that fell into that. What we want to do today is focus our attention on really looking at four big things. So we'll get started. Explain the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effects on economic transitions in Europe. And this is something that, if you remember from world history, talking about feudalism and then as we transition here, we start to hear a little bit more emphasis on capitalism, a term that, of course, we know Adam Smith will really have a lot to say about in the 1770s. But this is a really important thing that really, I think, drastically affects the European economy. So that's a theme to really pay attention to well. How growth of the Spanish Empire shaped social and economic structures. Thirdly, various worldviews of both Europeans and Native American. This is going to affect things from religion to social structure, the whole gamut of things. And then last but not least, for sure, the development of slavery and the importance of the caste system and how those two things impacted the status of populations. Okay, so when we're talking about status, what we're really talking about is kind of like a hierarchy of social classes, right, in these societies. Okay, so probably the most important thing early on in today's lesson is to understand, first of all, what is a basic working definition of Columbian Exchange? And a bit more importantly is, I think a lot of times when we think of it, we think of, well, you've got goods going from here over there and vice versa. What I think it's very easy, guys, for us to forget is that this exchange affects a very large number of people and not just continents. Okay, so let's kind of also keep in mind that we're talking about a lot of different things with this Columbian Exchange. So join me with the definition. You might even want to perhaps pause to record it. But anyway, trade of diseases. Yes, diseases went across the pond from the Americas to Europe and vice versa. However, what you tend to hear a lot about is, of course, the epidemic effects of disease on, of course, the Native American population, right? And so that's certainly something to really kind of concentrate on. But it also involved plants, animals, peoples, ideas, and resources. Now, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that a couple of things here that I want to really bring to your attention really quickly is that when we're talking about ideas, it's very easy for us to be like, well, religion was passed on, from Europe over to the New World. And we forget that there is going to be a good amount of interaction between the natives and also, of course, the Europeans. Okay, now whether or not that completely sets in or either side is going to truly adopt entirely the customs of the other group, that, of course, is going to be very much something open to interpretation. But understanding that it does impact them is important, right? The Native Americans, in many cases, we hear the story about Cortez and him coming over and conquering the Aztecs and things like that. Okay, but these Native Americans, some ways, did put up, for better or worse, the word fights or certainly opposition to some of these things that the Europeans were trying to do. Okay, so as you read and as you think about things, make sure that you keep that in mind. Okay, Atlantic world. This is going to be where we start to really use this expression pretty importantly. Okay, so it's an interaction. Again, you're seeing that term interaction, in other words, discourse of some sort between different groups of people. Okay, from the lands bordering the Atlantic Ocean. So we're talking about the continent of Africa, the two continents of North and South America, and also, of course, Western Europe. Okay, And of course, we really start to focus on this a lot as we look at the transition from the era of Columbus. Okay. The Great Dying. Okay. A lot of times we hear about the Black Legend concept. Okay. So, that certainly is something that plays into that. So, very important to keep in mind. Okay. And then last but not least, decreased Native American populations ensured victory by European powers. All right. So there's not going to be as much, population, right, to really stand up against these larger empires that have perhaps more, money in the sense of what we think about in the modern day, to really be able to invest heavily into these kinds of boats and ships and different resources to really militarily bring that up. Now that's also, keep in mind, going to create a pretty strong degree of competition between the different European nation states, right? I told the story last time about the sinking of the Spanish Armada, and how King Philip II putting a lot of resources into this armada. The British, of course, sunk it. And the result of that, of course, is going to be, you could make a really strong argument that the balance of power in Europe is really not going to be the same, right? We'll study that a little bit later as time moves on. Okay, so the question is, okay, what kinds of things are interacting, right? I like to use that word quite a bit with this famous Columbian Exchange. And I don't know if you many have memorized every single one of these, but certainly when you're looking at goods, you're looking at what's going from the Atlantic world and the Americas across and vice versa. Okay, so we talked about this before: squash, beans, okay, corn or maize. Okay, these are all things, potatoes, right? Those of you that are familiar with the famous, Irish potato famine, right? There's a reason why, the Irish become pretty reliant on that as a part of their diet, right? Diets in Europe are going to change, right? As a result of especially this Columbian exchange or interaction, okay? And so on the other side, chickens, horses, right? We know that horses are going to pretty dramatically change the nature of hunting, right? And things like that with a lot of these Native American tribes, okay? But the downside is when you're looking at the uneven exchange of disease, you'll notice you always hear stories about the syphilis that is going to affect the Europeans. But you notice, as you can see here, a much larger amount of disease that's going to be coming across the ocean from parts of Europe and then also parts of Africa. Okay, so when we think about this idea of Columbian exchange, we need to really think about it: exchange of goods, exchange of the disease, the ideas, the people. Okay, and so it transforms four continents very, I would argue, drastically and importantly. Okay, so nations are basically going to be like, well, we want wealth, right? We want resources, we want metals, gold, silver, right? Other things that are obviously very important eventually with the moral market, especially when you start to see, or shall we say, continue to see later on, the development of mercantilism, where you're trying to keep this balance of trade, but also this very strong amount of things like gold and silver defining the wealth of your nation, right? This is where this plays into it. Unfortunately, we have exploitation, which we'll look at later, through slavery, okay? And the one thing I pointed out in the last session, guys, just to make this clear, is a lot of times when we think of these large numbers of slaves coming across to the New World from parts of Africa, a lot of times we think we're like, well, they were there on large plantations, they farmed cotton, tobacco, etc. Okay, especially cotton, of course, sugarcane, especially in parts of the Caribbean. But as you can see here, we also have to keep in mind that there was a contribution with slave labor to the gold and silver, right, with mining. It's very easy to overlook that. Okay, so economies continue to grow as European nations acquired more colonies. Okay, so they're going to look at these colonies as forms of wealth. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, as we transition up time period or unit two, in three as well, you're going to start to see a lot of these, especially British colonists later on, being like, well, look at our contribution to your empire, right? And they're going to have these expectations that, well, look at what we're doing to contribute. And that's going to, of course, lead to some pretty significant conflict and even, I'm going to use the word revolution down the line. Okay. Feudalism declined due to increased wealth. Capitalism took its place. That is a big picture idea. Okay, think about when you studied world history and you looked at the Middle Ages and things like that. We don't have a lot of time to discuss this now, but think about when we think of feudalism, we think of vassals and lords. We think of things that are certainly linked to nobility and villages and kind of limits to those kinds of economic things. Well, what's going to happen is we notice that the nature of the economy is vastly going to change as a result of capitalism, right? People wanting to take it upon, I'm going to become wealthy, right? So it's almost like a drive, right, for people to do that. If you're in the class session today, you'll see more discussion on that, but you want to really keep that in the fronts of your minds, okay? And then most of the wealth benefited the aristocratic families, okay? I think that is a really important thing for us to keep in mind. When we think of aristocratic, a lot of times we think of this upper echelon of society. So yes, social class is still very much going to be affected by this transition to capitalism, right? Even though you are going to see a pretty strong change from feudalism to capitalism. Okay, so encounters with West Africa. We talked about a moment ago with the idea of slave labor. Okay, so something to keep in mind is that the Europeans are eventually going to become a lot more involved with the African slave trade. All right, so when we think of that, we think of eventually the famous Middle Passage, right, where you see this huge influx of deaths because of the horrible conditions on a lot of those ships, and then of course the famous triangular trade. Okay, slavery became more centered on race after Europeans began to colonize the Americas and the demand for labor increased. Okay, so we'll talk about a little bit with the origins of the Encomienda system with Spain, but we're going to build upon that as we move into Unit 2 with British settlement. Okay, African empires and city-states were involved in the slave trade. All right, so there is a connection to parts of Western Africa with the trade itself. Okay, and then a culture. Okay, so you got to remember, right, when you start to look at this interaction of culture, right, a lot of times we're like, okay, well, the Europeans coming over to the New World, we focus a lot on the interaction with the Native Americans, and we're not trying to downplay that, guys, but we also notice that these cultures that some of the Native Africans are bringing over, are actually going to be very important, right, with their languages and their religious customs and traditions. Okay, and then as we'll look at with a couple of our points in a moment, that there is going to be, because of this racial side and other factors, there is going to be arguments that are made with basically justifying the subjugation of others. All right, whether it's you're looking at them as not as civilized because they don't have the same religion or certain things outside of that. And so as you can imagine, you're going to have certain people, as we'll look at with a few minutes in a moment, within the church, especially the Catholic Church, that have a lot to say about those kinds of things. Okay, so the famous thing that we think of with this system of forced labor, if you will, is definitely going to be the Encomienda system. Now, I would encourage you all to maybe pause and write your own definition of what comes to mind when you think of the Encomienda system. Now, a little bit of background on this. So it's kind of like one of those debates, right, with Columbus. Was his intention to, create all these problems with disease, etc.? Well, what we notice with his fourth venture, right, his fourth voyage, as we call it, this is where we start to see really the further development of what we associate with the Encomienda system. Okay, so that's where you continue, shouldn't say start, but you continue to see debate about this eventual legacy of Columbus, or eventually what some people call this Black legend. Okay, so Encomenderos, basically leading men receive land and unpaid labor from all American Indians residing on the land. Okay, so this is where you notice like that, that use of the labor of the Native Americans with a lot of these things. So if you go and you look at like the settlement of parts of Dutch East Indies, I'm sorry, the West Indies, pardon me there, guys. You notice like a lot of eventual emphasis on plantations related to sugar, right, and things like that. Okay, and again, it's a way to gain wealth from Native Americans after they started trading willingly. Okay, and so you're not going to trade with us because they could probably see the handwriting on the wall with European influence. Now we're basically going to take it to another level with influencing you, with kind of forcing you to labor. Okay, and so this basically becomes a big deal as we continue to see further Spanish control over the New World. Okay, now in our last session, we looked briefly at a few, not all of them certainly, but a few of the major, explorers. You hear the word conquistadores, conqueror, if you will, Pizarro, with, of course, Incans, Cortez, with, of course, the Aztecs. These are very important things to keep in mind. All right. Now, something to keep in mind when you're looking at this time period. It's a fairly lengthy time period in respect, because you're looking at what is about 116 years of history. Okay. But what we're looking at, which is about 40 some odd years into it, Spain has already established a pretty strong foothold of a lot of the areas of the New World, right? Not all of them, certainly, but certainly a sizable number. Okay. So mineral wealth, like we said, the idea of, when you're looking at God, gold, and glory, well, metals and gold become a pretty important part of those systems. Okay. And so how they govern them, right? The idea of, again, creating like governors, viceroyalties, that's going to be a way to kind of keep order within the governed, or if you want to use the expression, conquered province. Okay. So that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind. So it's a way, it's almost like you've got the crown across the ocean, and they're basically giving people opportunities to govern, and they're giving them appointed positions in the process. Okay. The Spanish crown collected the quinto real, meaning royal fifth. As you can see here, 20% of the wealth produced in the Spanish colonies. Okay. That is a lot, 1/5, obviously, of that wealth. Okay. So again, that idea of economic reasoning or causes is pretty important. Okay. We see the rise of an important caste system that develops, and this caste system is going to have an effect on social structure, the idea of identity. As you can see here, I like the way it's worded here, hierarchy. Now, I don't know if you need to memorize every single one of these terms, but you notice, again, the Spanish are going to have different ways of interacting with the native population. The French will, the Dutch will, the English will, etc. Okay, but what you notice is this hierarchy based off really of racial composition. Peninsulares, that's going to be the group of Spaniards that, as you can see here, are born in Spain. All right, so that's going to be the highest hierarchy in the Americas, right? And again, that's based off, as you can see, of origin of birth. Criollos, all right, we would also call them Creoles. Okay, so you're looking at obviously people born in the colonies to Spanish parents. Okay, mestizos. All right, so you're looking at a mixture, right? A racial mixture, if you will, of Spanish and American Indian heritage. Mulattoes, people with mixed Spanish and African percentage. Okay, so again, you're looking at that interaction of Europeans with also Africans with producing offspring, and then eventually it has, as you can see here, its effect on society. The African population, and then Indios, which will be indigenous American Indians. Okay, so that's a really important thing. What I would encourage you to do is think about how does this structure, again, lead to that debate on subjugation based on race and also other kinds of factors. Okay, so very important that we keep that in mind. Okay, now this is where we get into the tail end of Unit 1, Part 2, and that is there are going to be debates. How do you treat these people? Okay, but one of the things is that you hear that God part of God, golden glory, the idea of expanding religion and Christianity. Okay, I can tell you a quick story that if you were somebody in the Americas, let's say a civilization or a culture, and let's say that you were not as likely to adopt these Christian beliefs and ideas, okay, it was not that uncommon for you to have a lesser degree of protection by the crown as opposed to those that actually were more adherent to actually accepting these beliefs. Okay, so again, a big debate is what is the maybe the biggest factor. You might even have to make an argument. What is the strongest factor that motivated European exploration? Was it religion? Was it economic consequence? Was it, along the lines of, let's say, to expand power, politically, militarily, perhaps? Any one of those 3 points could certainly be made a pretty strong argument. The key is evidence. How do you use evidence to support a claim? Okay, that'll be what we start to look at a little bit more in the coming weeks as we dive into writing. Okay, all right. So enslaved Native peoples were not easily converted due to the mistreatment that they faced. So I look at that as they had, they're going to obviously have some resistance. And then, as you can see here, theologians, jurists, and philosophers met at Valladolid to discuss moral and legal implications of conquest. Okay, the question with that comes down to this thing between human costs and also, the other things that motivate it. What I take from human costs, we look at, okay, these people are humans, right? They, whether they're Europeans or whatever, they obviously, there should be a moral set of values that guide the way that we basically deal with them. Okay. Other people are going to make arguments. I'm not condoning this, but there are arguments out there, if you look at the primary sources, that, yes, they're not as advanced as we are. And as a result of that, we have a right to basically subjugate them. So they justified it, right? And that's going to justify why they should become Christians, why basically, the idea of slave labor was basically justified, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so this meeting is big, right? So by this period of time, if you do the math, this is almost 60 years, right, into, the settlement of the Americas after Columbus. They're already starting to have debates within, the Catholic Church and so forth about the approach that they need to have. Okay. Last but not least, the idea of trying to convert the native population. Missions is big. Okay. So a lot of these missionaries, like you've heard of, probably New Mexico, certain other missionary, places and parts of Florida, et cetera. Okay. And so their main goal, as you could see, is to convert to Christianity. In this case, their form of Roman Catholicism. They would learn languages. They would learn customs to an extent in cases. Okay. Perhaps intermarry within some of the cultures and things. Again, keep in mind that hierarchy of social structure. Okay. But they would also push, their form of European customs as well. Economic. So trade customs are going to be very different. Okay. And so why is that a big deal? Well, if you want to pause the slide for a moment before I run through it, basically what we're looking at is eventually Spain is going to start to see some decline with their empire. Okay. Partly due to obviously that defeat by Britain in the later 1580s. But as you can see here, every Native American civilization did not just say, well, okay, you're going to try to conquer us or influence this way. Here's an example. Obviously, 1598, which is a little bit over 100 years after Columbus first came, so toward the end of our time period, Juan Oñate seized corn, clothing, and basically, as you can see there, did not treat the resistors in the best way. Okay. Retaliation. Some Spaniards died. Okay. The Spanish retaliated. Okay. And so it might be like, okay, these people can't be converted the way we want them to. We're just going to basically abandon them. Okay. Which for those people might sound like a good thing. Okay. We're going to be able to basically be on our own again. But that's going to be one of the reasons why we eventually see more of this missionary mindset. Santa Fe, New Mexico. Okay. Obviously, important to keep in mind. Now, for those of you that are in class, we'll do this as a separate lesson. If you are not in class today because of a technology issue, you should have read a series of 4 documents for your document focus of the day. 2 of them were actually based off of pictures or visuals. The other 2 were actually based off of excerpts. What I would ask for you to do with a few minutes of your time is to consider these 4 questions that we as a whole class will be discussing to try to bring a little bit of food for thought with those 4 documents into it. We're going to spend probably the most time looking at question 3, which is the famous debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda over, of course, the Encomienda system and the pretty obviously harsh treatment of the Native American population and the effects of it. I would encourage you to really have some solid thoughts on that. This is not something that you have to submit as a separate assignment, but it is a class engagement. Last but not least, as we transition to Friday and next week, I would like to remind you that you should submit, if you already haven't, your summer primary source assignment, if you've not done so. Secondly, you should have already attempted at least one time your mastery quiz. If you have not gotten 80% or higher, 40 out of 50, then please make sure that you've taken that at least a second time to show that you're ready to move on with mastery. Okay. And then you should have already submitted your fabric primary source reading assignment for today. Please make sure that you use the template. If you did that, then it should have been in Word or PDF form. Pictures are fine. If it's actual written work, just make sure that it's legible. Tomorrow's office hours on Friday for AP will be from 11 to noon. We will basically cover anything that you have questions about. We'll talk about the documents more, and we're going to focus our attention on kind of reviewing the thinking skills for the week, how to be active note takers, how to basically really break down a source, a primary source. So if you can attend that, great. If not, there's actually a video clip on that that's about 20 minutes long that will walk you through that. I would encourage you to begin your Unit 2 preparation. That is already going to be there in Canvas for you. And as always, feel free to actually contact me if you have any questions at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. I hope this has been a really good first unit. Unit 2, we will start next week for the next 2 weeks on British colonial settlement, Jamestown, moving until about 1754. And I look forward to a great next week. and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.